I was shocked when I saw my wife leave the company dinner hand in hand with her lover, and, instinctively, I looked away as if that would erase the scene. I got up, left the room, and with it, our history. "You just buried everything we built," was all I could say before turning away. Months later, I found a new love, one who offered me silent loyalty and an affection that requires no vigilance. She, realizing that her lover only wanted adventure, found herself alone, with an emptiness that not even time fills. One day, we met by chance. She asked for forgiveness with her eyes, and I gave mine with words. I forgave, yes, but so that each of us could move on unburdened. Without resentment, but also without return. And that's when she understood she had lost me as a life partner. But none of this happened overnight. Before leaving that room, I had to stifle the scream building in the back of my throat. The air seemed thicker, and my fingers trembled as if they had a life of their own. I don't know if it was the cheap wine, the dim lighting, or the way she intertwined her fingers with his with the same ease she did with me at home, on the couch, during our Saturday night movies. I felt everything I knew quietly crumble. No one screamed. There was no scandal. But inside me, something crumbled violently. I became an invisible man. She was 2 meters away and could no longer see me. I had to watch, helpless, the death of everything we had built, there, on that silent night, where the sound of silverware and fake laughter became the soundtrack to the end of my story with her. What destroyed me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the disrespect. The lack of hesitation in her touch, the way she smiled at him as if she'd never smiled at me like that before. As if all the years of complicity, of plans, of shared pain and silent conquests held no weight. As if I'd never been enough. And maybe, in her mind, I really never had been. Because she was already there with him. With someone else. While I was still struggling to believe it was really happening. That night, I left before she saw me. Before anyone noticed the abyss forming in my chest. I got in my car and drove aimlessly. I spent hours driving through empty streets, trying to piece together what was left of my dignity. When morning came, I still had no answers. Only questions. Where had I gone wrong? What else did she want that I hadn't given? Why would someone trade stability for doubt, care for instinct, certainty for adrenaline? It took me weeks to understand that sometimes the problem isn't with the one who loves, but with the one who doesn't know how to receive love. I didn't call, I didn't confront, I didn't yell. I just disappeared. I took off my ring, left the key on the living room table, and sent a short message: "Take good care of what's left. I'm leaving." She only replied hours later, with a "Can we talk?" that hung in the air. It was too late. Sometimes, love doesn't die with a scream, but with silence. And my silence said everything my heart could no longer repeat. The loneliness of the following days was a cruel mix of relief and pain. Relief at no longer having to pretend everything was okay. Pain at realizing she hadn't chosen me for a long time. And yet, it was as if I were mourning someone who was still alive. I slept for days on a friend's couch, then rented a small apartment with cold walls and windows that faced nowhere. There, amid cheap furniture and stacked boxes, I began to rebuild myself. Slowly. In silence. With the kind of pain you don't share with anyone. Time passed. The wound became a scar. And when I least expected it, I met someone. Unlike anything I'd ever known. She didn't try to fill me, didn't demand anything, just offered me her presence. She was like a warm blanket after years of facing endless winters. She listened with her eyes, spoke calmly, and looked at me as if every broken piece of me was worthy of care. It was in her lap that I was reborn. Unhurried. Unguilty. Unafraid. Meanwhile, the other. Well, the other realized, too late, that her lover's fire was just that, fire. Burning, intense, but fleeting. What had seemed like passion became annoyance. The dates dwindled, the messages cooled, the glances lost their spark. When she tried to rekindle, she realized he was already searching for other flames. She stood there, with the ashes of what she thought was love. And only then did she look back. Only then did she realize what she had let slip away. And me? I was long gone. We met by chance, on a random street, on a random day. She looked at me as if she'd seen a ghost. I smiled lightly. There was peace in my heart. Peace in knowing I no longer felt anger, nor desire for revenge. Only pity. And a longing that no longer hurt. She tried to say something, but couldn't. Her eyes said more than any words. I simply said, "It's okay. I forgive." And she understood. She understood that forgiveness wasn't an invitation to return, but a key for each of us to move on without carrying unnecessary burdens. But what she didn't know, what she could never have imagined, is that since that night, since the end, since the silence of my departure, I became a stranger in her dreams. A man she loved too late. A regret that returned in the form of a memory. Because time doesn't heal everything, sometimes, it only teaches us to live with what never returns. And then the dreams began. She would wake in the middle of the night, panting, after reliving in her dreams scenes from our old home, me making coffee, laughing at something silly she'd say, lying with her on the couch after work, the smell of my perfume when I hugged her when I got home, my hand on her face before bed, the "I love you" whispered in her ear, the plans for a trip we never took, the names of children who never came. She dreamed of my smile. She dreamed of my voice. And she would wake, dawn after dawn, with tears streaming down her face, trying to grasp the air for a past that no longer existed. Regret invaded her brutally. There was no one beside her to hold her hand. Only a silence laden with absences. She began discreetly following me on social media. She saw photos of me with my new wife. She saw me smiling. She saw me loving again. She saw me light. She saw me whole. And that was the part that tore her apart the most, realizing that the happiness she'd rejected had been embraced by someone else. And that the place that was hers now belonged to someone who never had to compete for it. Then she tried to write to me. She deleted and rewrote messages. Hi, how are you, that never got sent. And, I miss you, that died on the screen. Forgive me, that had nowhere to land. Because there was no longer any space. Time, which had once seemed frozen, now flew by too quickly. And she remained stuck, trapped on the day she lost me. I followed. And every step away from her was a step toward myself. But there's one thing she never knew. Something that's been kept hidden. Something I might never say out loud. A barely noticeable detail, but one that changes everything. And that's exactly what she would discover, too late. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of cheating is romanticized or supported. All stories are fictional, but they carry deep truths, because they show how betrayal tears hearts apart, breaks up homes and destroys what is most valuable. Trust. Our goal is clear, to make you feel, reflect and understand that some choices cannot be reversed. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense, realistic and deeply shocking story. Good story. They met on a muggy November afternoon in a small coffee shop where almost no one spoke loudly and the ambient music seemed hand-picked to accompany the undisturbed silences. It was there, between an impatient line and a mixed-up order, that Daniel and Laura bumped into each other for the first time. She smiled with the corner of her mouth and apologized for spilling coffee on his white shirt. He laughed it off and said the accident had brightened his day. Sometimes fate has this strange sense of humor, of crossing paths with people who weren't looking for anything, but still carried within them a space waiting to be filled. Daniel, at 33, was a man with a calm voice, an attentive gaze, and a kindness that seemed from another era. He had a solid career, loyal friends, and a history of brief but intense relationships, as if his soul were always open, but few knew how to truly read what lay within it. Laura, on the other hand, had come from a series of frustrated attempts. Attempts to be understood, to hold her own in a world that forced her into meaningless routines. She worked in events, was practical, determined, full of energy, and sometimes, without realizing it, full of fear too. Fear of not being enough, of being forgotten, of repeating the same mistakes she'd seen in her own childhood home. But with Daniel, things finally seemed to click. From the start, there was a kind of connection between them that couldn't be taught or rehearsed. He listened with genuine attention. Not just to what she was saying, but to what she couldn't put into words. She, in turn, made him laugh like he hadn't laughed in years and touched his life with a lightness that disarmed even the heaviest days. Their relationship grew naturally. There were no games, no strategies, none of that tiresome theater of early relationships where everything must be perfect. Laura had her moments of impulsive anger, Daniel his bouts of silence. But there was acceptance. And love. A love built on routine, on lazy Sunday breakfasts, on holding hands in slow traffic, on texts during work hours that said, "I just want to hear your voice." The complicity between them was visible to anyone nearby. Friends commented on how they seemed to understand each other with their eyes, how a glance was enough for conversation to flow without words. And though neither said it out loud, they both knew they were, finally, at home in each other. They moved in together after a year and a half of dating. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, with a balcony facing the sunset and enough space to dream of a dog, maybe even children. The move was marked by makeshift boxes, pizza on the floor, and the good old-fashioned exhaustion of starting something new. Laura decorated the living room with colorful pillows and paintings of trips they hadn't yet taken, while Daniel tended the kitchen like someone preparing the ground for the best late-night conversations. Every corner of the house became a reflection of their feelings, safe, welcoming, and authentic. The first few years were happy. Not perfect, but genuine. They sometimes argued over trivial matters, the remote control, the dishes forgotten in the sink, the time for dinner. But at the end of the day, they always lay side by side, telling stories or just breathing together, as if that shared silence were the most honest form of love. Daniel always had a way of calming her without much effort. And Laura, even in the most turbulent times, made a point of showing she was there, present, willing, connected. When he lost his father, she held tight to his grief. When she had an anxiety attack at work, he was the one who dropped everything to come and find her and stood by her side, silently, holding her hand as the world spun faster than she could keep up. It seemed as if nothing could destabilize this couple. They seemed to have built not just a relationship, but an alliance. A silent pact of mutual care. They planned for the future with a rare ease, trips, car upgrades, home renovations. They talked about having children with a kind of naturalness that was startlingly mature. Their families got along well, their friends rooted for them, and every celebration, birthdays, Christmas, New Year's, was marked by looks that said, "We're doing everything right." But it's curious how small details also create rifts. A longer glance at your phone, a subtle change in tone of voice, a kiss that became just an automatic touch of lips. Life sometimes accommodates distances we don't realize in time. Daniel began to notice that hugs were shorter, glances rarer, conversations less profound. Laura was becoming increasingly absent, even though she was present. And even though she continued to fulfill all her roles, dinner ready, good morning messages, social smiles at family gatherings, there was something different. As if, somewhere between the laughter and the silence, she had left without leaving the house. He tried not to overthink it. He attributed it to routine, to work stress, to the natural fatigue of long-term relationships. After all couples go through phases like this. That's what the books, the friends, the on-call love counselors said. But there was a nagging intuition, a restlessness in his chest that wouldn't be silenced. He began to wonder if he was still the same man she'd fallen in love with. He tried to recapture the spark of the beginning. He organized surprise dinners, left loving notes, suggested short trips, just the two of them. And she, always polite, always correct, thanked him, smiled, but her eyes remained distant. As if fixed on something or someone he couldn't see. Despite this, Daniel persisted. Because he believed that love was also about persistence. That passion could die, but the commitment to remain had to weather the storms. Laura, for her part, seemed to float between two worlds, the secure stability she had built with him, and an invisible one, full of possibilities that perhaps even she didn't fully understand. Her schedules began to become more flexible. Dinners were cancelled due to last-minute meetings, work trips suddenly arose, changes in the way she dressed for going out. Details. Always the details. And Daniel, though hurt inside, continued to believe it was just a phase, that they would return to their former selves, that every couple goes through winters before finding spring again. He said nothing. He made no accusations. He watched. And he loved. Perhaps even more intensely. As if he sensed, in some silent layer of reality, that she was slowly slipping from his arms. But instead of grasping her by force, he tried to rekindle the bonds with tenderness. Because that was how he loved, without games, without dispute, without pride. It was a complete love. And it was precisely this complete love that, unbeknownst to him, was being compared to something new, exciting, incomplete, yet intoxicating. Because human beings are, at times, cruel to themselves. They exchange certainty for uncertainty, love for vanity, peace for adrenaline. But Daniel didn't know that yet. All he knew at that moment was the woman he loved, lying there beside him, her face turned to the wall, breathing a restless sleep. And he, with his eyes open in the darkness of the room, whispered to himself that this was just a phase. That true love always finds its way back. He had no idea that soon, his life would change completely. That the silence that now surrounded him would be shattered by a brutal truth. That the hands he held so dearly were, little by little, yielding to another touch. The night seemed calm. The apartment was in order. The smells, the sounds, the furniture, everything in its place. But inside that home, something had already begun to break. And when the truth came out, there would be no way to put the pieces back together the same way. All that was left was to move forward, and rebuild. Even if it had to be from scratch. Even if it had to be with someone else. Even if it had to be with another soul. Daniel began to notice the small voids widening inside the house as frequently as the silences between him and Laura took on new hues. They weren't fights, nor were they arguments. They were absences camouflaged by ordinary words, automatic responses, and smiles that only came halfway. Before, when he returned from work, he'd find her a place to rest. Now, he found a distracted woman with a distant look in her eyes, who claimed to be tired but spent hours on her phone before bed. Her messages lost their spark. There were no longer the sweet reminders, the "I missed you" messages, or the weekend plans. Everything seemed to be done out of obligation. Even the kisses. Even the touches. He tried to find rational excuses for it. Maybe it was just exhaustion, maybe she was going through a rough patch at work and didn't want to worry anyone. Maybe he was the one who was too insecure, too anxious, seeing things where they didn't exist. But there was something he could no longer deny, she was no longer there, even if she was physically there. A chasm was forming between them, and no matter how hard he tried to build bridges, they crumbled after just a few steps. Daniel began to keep everything to himself. The urge to ask what was happening, the fear of the answer, the silent desperation. At get-togethers with friends, he pretended everything was fine. At family gatherings, he made a point of smiling beside her, even though inside he was imploding. Laura, for her part, maintained an impeccable routine. She always had an excuse to leave work late, to go to events, to meet the last-minute commitments that arose on the weekends. She was always made up, elegant, with that sparkle in her eyes Daniel hadn't seen in months at home. And he would understand, even if he didn't want to. He noticed she was dressing up more, that she smiled differently when she saw certain messages, that she carried her phone with her even into the bathroom, that she'd changed the device's password without telling her. She tried to ignore these signs, stifling the pain with tasks, immersing herself in work, cooking for them both as if it were still possible to keep things going with recipes, flowers, and breakfasts prepared in silence. But there were times when he could no longer pretend. Like that night he'd unexpectedly returned home early to find Laura rushing out, wearing too much makeup for a simple team meeting. She'd been startled, smiled tightly, and said she hadn't expected to see him there. He wanted to ask who she was meeting, but remained silent. He limited himself to a light kiss and watched her walk out the door, feeling like he was watching a slow-motion goodbye movie. When she turned the corner, he stood there, the scent of her perfume still in the air, wondering how long it had been since she'd left without warning. The following weeks were an emotional massacre. With her every gesture, he tried to find traces of the woman he'd known. He tried to find in her some trace of guilt, a gesture of love, a hesitation that indicated she was confused, that there was still a chance to rescue her. But Laura seemed distant and at the same time comfortable. She acted lightly, giving no openings. It was as if she were relieved to have stopped pretending, even if she hadn't yet confessed. And Daniel, increasingly silent, began to lose his appetite, his sleep, the joy in his eyes. He felt diminished, questioning his own presence, his value, his importance. He began to look at himself in the mirror strangely, as if there were a stranger he no longer recognized. He decided not to invade her privacy. He didn't read messages, didn't go through her phone, didn't ask direct questions. He didn't want answers he already sensed. He hoped that, at some point, she would be honest. That she would sit down with him and tell him the truth, however harsh. But time passed, and the truth only consumed him, being guessed at, unsaid. It was like living a lie with a set date to explode. Until, one Saturday night, during the annual dinner of the company where she worked, it all finally happened. Daniel didn't want to go. He was exhausted, but he thought it would be important to be there, to be present, to support. Laura was particularly excited. She spent hours getting ready, changing her dress 3 times, insisting on leaving early, claiming she needed to help with the organization. He arrived a little later, wearing the suit she always said she loved, with a flower in the pocket that matched the tie she'd chosen weeks before. The room was full, the yellow lights creating an elegant atmosphere, fake smiles mingled with empty greetings. Daniel moved among the guests looking for her, until he spotted Laura in a far corner of the room. Time seemed to slow down. She wasn't alone. She was holding hands with another man. It wasn't an innocent gesture. It was the kind of intimate touch, charged with familiarity and affection, that couldn't be justified. She was leaning toward him, laughing at something he was saying, with a look Daniel hadn't seen in months. The blood drained from her face, her hands froze, and her feet remained rooted to the floor as if the world had rooted her pain in that moment. She looked away instinctively. Looking too much hurt. And Daniel, even in pieces, chose not to make a fuss. He took a deep breath, turned his back, and left. There was nothing more to say. Love doesn't end with shouting, sometimes it ends in silence. In the car, still parked in front of the place, he didn't cry. He didn't feel angry. Just a deep tiredness. A soul-draining exhaustion. As if all his feelings had been drained at once. What hurt most was remembering the attempts, the sleepless nights, the carefully prepared dinners, the plans made for 2 while she was already silently making others with someone else. He started the engine, drove aimlessly through streets that seemed emptier than ever. And for the first time, he accepted, she was no longer his. Maybe she never really had been. Laura didn't try to hide it. When she returned home in the early hours of the morning, she found his ring on the living room table. A note with just a few words, "You just buried everything we've built." Not a single word. No explanation. She read it silently, as if knowing that, deep down, there was no longer any way to defend the indefensible. She sat on the sofa, holding the ring between her fingers, and let the weight of guilt settle in slowly, like a delayed action poison. Outside, the wind flapped the curtains, bringing a piercing silence into a home now empty of everything. The following week, Daniel disappeared. He left no trace, didn't answer calls, didn't reply to messages. He requested a transfer at work, changed his number, and moved to a small apartment far from everything. He wanted a fresh start. He needed to find himself again. And Laura, for the first time, felt what it was like to be abandoned. Not by physical absence, but by the permanent absence of someone who loved her deeply. She began to relive the moments with him. The laughter at the supermarket, the lazy Sundays, the dances in the kitchen, the hugs in the middle of the night. But now they were just memories. And memories don't hug back. Weeks turned into months. Life went on, but with a bitter taste of emptiness. The things that once seemed so obvious, touch, affection, peace, now seemed distant, unattainable. Laura tried to convince herself she'd made choices, but the truth is, some choices are just disguises for unresolved escapes. And running away from yourself is a long, cold, and irreversible road. But what Laura didn't yet know, was that there was something more. Something she had no idea about. A detail that would completely change what she thought she knew about that story. Something hidden between the lines of the pain she had caused, and that was yet to come. As the months passed and silence solidified as the new language between Daniel and Laura, time began to construct its own versions of the past. They didn't speak. They didn't seek each other out. They no longer shared coffee, a couch, or the last slice of pizza on cold nights. He moved on, distant, trying to organize a life that no longer included the woman he believed he'd loved forever. She, in turn, tried to maintain a balance between guilt and pride, like someone walking on broken pieces while pretending they were still on solid ground. Memories surfaced at random times, in solitary breakfasts, in the oversized bed, in the silence of the car on the way back from some event they would once have shared together. But it was only when the dreams began to come, intense, vivid, full of sensations, that she understood the gravity of what she had lost. The hardest part wasn't remembering him. It was dreaming of him laughing, holding her, looking at her with a love that no longer existed anywhere but within her. She woke with a wet pillow, trying to grasp time with empty hands. And what hurt most was realizing he was gone, along with everything she'd ever held dear. No companionship could replace the peace he brought. No other man aroused the same respect in her. The lover who had once seemed electrifying was now nothing more than an embarrassing memory. A mistake. An escape that only took her further away from herself. And in this abyss of absence, she decided to search for Daniel. Their reunion wasn't planned. It was chance that brought them face to face in a discreet bookstore, on a random late afternoon. She recognized him from behind, by the way he held the book, by his usual calm demeanor. When he turned, their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She smiled shyly, uncertainly. He responded with a slight, gentle, yet restrained nod. His face was serene. His eyes were clear and weightless. It disconcerted her. She expected anger, resentment, or at least discomfort. But she found peace. A peace she hadn't known since he left. Laura gathered her courage and approached. She tried to make conversation, to talk about the book in his hands, but her own voice sounded fragile, almost childish. Daniel responded politely. He listened, commented, but his attention was no longer hers. He looked into her eyes, but no longer inhabited that space with the same warmth as before. And it was during this polite and uncomfortable exchange that a woman approached him, smiling naturally. She embraced him with a simple gesture, lightly touching his arm, and said something quietly that made Daniel smile. Laura knew in that moment. This woman wasn't fleeting. There was a silent intimacy between them that Laura recognized. It was the kind of look she herself had received years ago. But now it came from someone else. Still, he wasn't cruel. He asked if she wanted to grab a coffee nearby. He said it naturally, like someone offering something out of respect. She accepted, even though she knew it might hurt. They went to a nearby coffee shop and sat across from each other. He ordered his usual, and she hesitated before choosing, realizing she couldn't remember if she still liked the same things. The conversation started off light. Superficial updates, how her parents were doing, how he'd adjusted to the new neighborhood, how their old mutual friends were doing. But there was a weight hanging over the table. A weight she knew she needed to lift. Then she apologized. Not with grand speeches, but with sincerity in her eyes. She said she wasn't there to try to win him back, that she expected nothing, but needed him to know she regretted it. That she made a wrong choice. That she confused freedom with abandonment. That she sought something outside that she already had inside. Daniel listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't respond. When she finished, he took a deep breath, held the cup with both hands, and, in a low voice, said he forgave her. But he concluded by saying that forgiveness didn't mean getting back together. That she had broken something inside him that couldn't be rebuilt the same way. And that, despite the pain, he had found a new path. One that didn't require vigilance, insecurity, or fear. A silent but whole love. She nodded, feeling her chest burn. She said she dreamed about him almost every night. That she saw herself in the same scenarios they'd experienced together, as if her subconscious was trying to reconstruct what her choices had destroyed. And it was there, between one confession and another, that Daniel said something she hadn't expected to hear. Something that would forever change the way she viewed her own story. He told her that, before discovering the betrayal, he already knew she was distant. And so, in a desperate attempt to save her, he wrote letters. One a week, for 3 months. Letters he never delivered. Letters in which he tried to remind her of who they were. Of the little things. Of the reasons they'd fallen in love. Of the promises they'd made within the walls of the house where they'd lived. Each letter was a silent plea for her to return. Not physically, but emotionally. For her to reconnect. For her to remember who she was with him. Laura stared at him, unable to respond. He continued, saying he'd left all those letters in a box in his office drawer, with her name handwritten on the lid. That he'd silently hoped she'd find them one day, or that he'd have the courage to deliver them himself. But never happened. Betrayal came first. And then, the day he left, he burned them all. One by one. In the backyard, while the city slept. He said he watched the smoke rise, as if each piece of paper carried with it a piece of what remained of their love. She whispered a broken, "Why?" And he replied that he no longer wanted to carry words that had no destination. It was at that moment that she broke down. The tears came uncontrollably, as if they'd been held back for months and now finally found their way. She put her hands to her face, trying to hold back the tears, but it was useless. She was crying for the letters she hadn't read. For the days she'd ignored. For the touch she'd rejected. For the man who left not for lack of love, but for too much of it. Daniel got up, went to the counter, paid the bill, and returned to the table. He told her she didn't need to blame herself forever, but she needed to understand that some losses are permanent. And that he was no longer hers. That there was someone now who made him want to write new letters, not burn old ones. On the way out, she walked him to the door. They stood there for a few seconds, silent. She wanted to say more, but there was no more room for words. He simply smiled gently, placed a light kiss on her forehead, and said, "I forgive you. But I'm moving on." And he walked away, walking down the sidewalk as the sun began to sink below the horizon. Laura stood still, watching him walk away, until he disappeared into the crowd. And she knew, finally, that she had lost him not on the day of the betrayal, but in that instant, faced with that simple, brutal truth, there was someone now who held the dreams that had once been hers. But there was something else. Something Daniel didn't say. Something she would only discover days later, when she met a mutual friend. A detail that would forever change her understanding of herself, of the past, of what she had lost. Because the pain of loss hadn't yet reached its deepest point. Not until she understood what else had been taken away with that choice. And when she finally did, there was no one left to explain it. 2 days after the unexpected encounter in that bookstore, Laura still carried the weight of what she'd heard, but there was something that still kept her restless, as if there was a part of that story that Daniel hadn't revealed. She sensed, in every gesture, that there was more behind the silence. His gaze said something that words couldn't convey, and although her conscience was already torn by the truths he'd exposed, something inside her cried out to understand what exactly she'd destroyed, beyond what she could see. It wasn't about winning him back anymore. It was about understanding the full extent of the consequences of her choices. The next afternoon, on impulse, she decided to visit an old friend whom, ironically, she'd recently pushed away during her extramarital affair, believing that nothing and no one needed to be a priority beyond her current desires. Sitting on a park bench where they used to chat during their college years, among trees dried by autumn, Laura revealed her confession about her reunion with Daniel. She spoke of the letters, the pain, the forgiveness she'd received, the tears she'd swallowed. Her friend listened with a mixture of compassion and hesitation, until, in a gesture of discomfort, she fidgeted with her coat sleeves and looked away. Laura noticed the strange, almost tense silence and pressed to know if there was anything else she needed to hear. And that was when the truth came out. Her friend told her that, a few months before their separation, Daniel had confided in her that they were trying to have a child. That, although Laura didn't know it, he'd already taken tests, adjusted his routine, and stopped drinking wine on Friday nights, all in secret, because he wanted to surprise her with the news that he was ready to embark on this new phase. But that wasn't all. What she heard next made her world spin and her stomach churn with the force of a blow she couldn't see coming. Her friend said that, days before the company dinner, the one where everything fell apart, Daniel had received his final test results, and the doctor had confirmed that he could, indeed, be a father. He had bought her a small, symbolic gift, a box containing a baby shoe and a handwritten note saying, "I'm ready for our biggest project, our family." That was what he planned to deliver that night. That was what Laura crushed with the heel of his absence as she held another man's hand. She stood paralyzed. She felt as if her body no longer belonged to her. This was more than a mistake. It was an emotional crime. A betrayal of a love that still believed, that still made plans, that still built a future while she destroyed everything blindfolded. She broke down right there, in the square, in front of a friend who now barely knew how to console her. The tears didn't come as they had before. They were no longer contained. It was a naked, primal despair, carrying within it the pain of having murdered something pure, innocent, with her own hands. Everything made sense now. Daniel's silence, the weight of his gaze, the way he didn't explode, didn't scream, didn't retaliate. Because he knew. He knew what he was losing. He knew what she was giving up, without even knowing it was the chance to build something he'd never wanted with anyone else before. For days, Laura couldn't sleep. The images repeated in her head like a looping nightmare, the gift never delivered, the burned letters, the looks she rejected, the hand she let go of. She began to avoid the mirror. She didn't recognize herself. She could no longer wear the mask of a strong, determined woman. She was fragile, empty, imploded. She tried to write to him. But she didn't know what to say. What do you write to someone you've ripped away the ground, the dreams, the hope of a family? He began to frequent the same places they used to go. Not to find him, but to see if some remnant of her old self would resurface. On every corner, a memory. In every memory, a thorn. 2 weeks passed. And it was by chance that she saw him again. It was an outdoor event, a cultural fair, something light-hearted, where families spread out with children, couples shared ice cream and laughter. She was with a friend, trying to force normalcy into her own existence, when she saw him in the distance. Daniel was walking with his new companion. But now something was different. She was holding a child in her arms. A boy. He must have been around 2 years old. Laura felt her legs give out. She couldn't process it. Was this real? Was this his son? But time didn't add up. 2 years. Did that mean the child already existed before everything ended? Her heart raced. A whirlwind of hypotheses formed in her mind, but none of them made sense. She decided to follow their footsteps from a distance, not out of obsession, but out of necessity. She needed to understand. She waited for her chance. When Daniel stepped away to buy something, she approached the woman. Emotion choked her voice, but she managed to say, "Hi," without shaking too much. The polite woman recognized her and, out of politeness, responded. Laura then asked bluntly who the boy was. The woman hesitated, looking at the little boy, who smiled innocently, unsure of what his name stirred in the heart of this strange woman. And it was there, in that moment, that the final truth came to light. The boy was not Daniel's biological son. He was her son, the woman's. A child he had chosen to love and raise as his own. He had met the woman months after their separation, and upon discovering she had a son from a previous relationship, he didn't hesitate to assume the paternal role with a dedication only a man who had had his own dreams ripped away could offer. Laura nearly collapsed right there. The boy was living proof that Daniel had truly moved on, but not just with another body, with another life. He had done with that boy what he planned to do with her, become a father. Not out of genetic obligation, but out of love. He had found another family to love. And that was, perhaps, the hardest lesson she could ever receive. Because there was no revenge, no drama. There was only the real consequences of what she had thrown away. Daniel didn't build a new path to revenge. He simply rebuilt his life from the broken pieces, and found elsewhere what she hadn't known how to appreciate when she had it. When Daniel returned and saw her there, standing beside the child and the woman, everything was silent for several long seconds. She stared at him with teary eyes. He calmly put his arm around her and said, "I think you two already know each other." Laura forced a smile and simply replied with a yes. There was nothing more that could be said. She was no longer anywhere in his story. Not in the present, not in the future. And that certainty gnawed at her with a pain that came not from outside, but from within, from the depths of her soul. Returning home, Laura sat on the edge of her bed and remained there for hours, staring into the void. The memory of the gift never delivered, the burned letters, the child that never existed between them, the love she couldn't protect. All of this was now a scar that would never fade. She had lost the man who loved her with everything he was, and there was no crueler punishment than knowing he was still capable of loving, but not her. Never her again. And in that moment, with no one around, no more defenses, no more excuses, Laura understood, for the first time, the true meaning of regret. Not the kind of regret that seeks forgiveness, but the kind that knows there's nothing left to recover. Simply learning to live with the absence of something that was once everything. And that is, perhaps, the deepest punishment anyone can bear. Laura spent the entire last night awake. There was no comfortable position in bed, no blanket to alleviate the chill coming from within, no silence sufficient to silence her thoughts. Her mind was a suffocating labyrinth, where every memory bumped into guilt, every memory turned into a thorn. Through the bedroom window, she watched the dawn creep by unhurriedly, while her sweaty hands gripped the sheets as if trying to hold on to something that had already collapsed. His name came to mind with an almost physical weight, along with the images that now repeated themselves with precise cruelty, the boy in the new woman's arms, the affectionate gesture, the calm in his eyes, the absolute absence of any need to prove anything. There was no arrogance, no mockery. Just a new life. A life that didn't even include her as a memory. In the morning, she left home with no clear direction. She needed air, a space where she could lose herself from her own pain. She walked through ancient streets, places that still bore the invisible scars of what her life with Daniel had once been. Every park bench, every corner cafe, every storefront reflected her guilt differently. There was no escape. neither forward nor backward. And the further she walked, the more she realized she was surrounded by a city that no longer had color, only traces of everything that had ceased to be. People went about their daily lives, oblivious to the intimate tragedy unfolding within her. And that was one of the most heartbreaking parts, realizing that the world continued, even when hers had stopped. The dilemma deepened cruelly. Because Laura wasn't a woman without a conscience. She knew she'd made a mistake. She knew she'd hurt, betrayed, turned her back on a love that was whole. But what consumed her now was what to do with that regret. What do you do when there's no one left to ask for an explanation? When forgiveness has been granted, but there's no room for redemption? When time has passed, and the one you hurt has not only gotten over you, but rebuilt happiness in someone else's arms? She longed to go back in time, not to make amends, because she knew that was impossible, but to feel, even if only for a moment, the version of herself that existed before the betrayal. The woman who was chosen, admired, deeply loved. She wanted to reconnect with the one Daniel saw so clearly, but whom she herself had failed to appreciate. This search for self was the greatest punishment. There was no one left to blame, and the only company left was the deafening sound of her own regret. In the days that followed, Laura withdrew from everything: friends, social media, events. She began to live a life of near reclusion. There was no longer any taste in her food, no color in her clothes. Only the attempt to survive herself. She began writing letters that would never be sent. Not to Daniel, she knew he no longer needed to hear them, but to the woman she had been, to try to understand where the ruin had begun. In one, she wrote, "It wasn't him who left. It was me who left. And now, that I no longer know how to return, I understand the value of the doors I myself closed." She kept the letters in a small box, as if each page were a piece of forgiveness she would never receive in return. But there was one thought that wouldn't leave her alone. Something that returned every night when she turned out the lights and the room plunged into darkness. The image of the boy. The way Daniel held him, the smile on the child's face, the harmony between them. She wondered if that could have been hers. Not the boy himself, but his life. The experience of motherhood alongside someone who would truly be there, who would build with her, who would choose her every day with the same eyes. And more than that, knowing that he still had it inside him, this desire to start a family, this kind of love, and that now he was giving it to someone else. That was the part that ached silently, without leaving visible marks. Amidst isolation, she decided to seek therapy. For the first time, not because of a breakdown, but because she understood she needed to rebuild her identity before it was completely consumed. In the first sessions, she could barely speak. The words came slurred, stuck in her throat. But little by little, she began to open up. She told her story without embellishments, without trying to assuage her guilt. And little by little, she began to understand that the betrayal she committed wasn't just against Daniel, but against herself. She betrayed the woman she wanted to be, the values she claimed to uphold, the story she had chosen to build. It wasn't out of love for another, it was an escape from herself. And that was even harder to admit. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life without any major upheaval. There were, yes, memories. But they were like old photographs, ones you keep in a drawer and only revisit when you're ready. There was no more pain. His reunion with Laura had sealed what he already knew, that loving someone deeply didn't obligate him to continue suffering for them. His new partner brought a calm, uncluttered kind of love, and the boy was the piece he hadn't even known was missing in the puzzle of his life. He didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to live. One day, while picking up the boy from school, Daniel received an unexpected message. It was from a mutual friend he hadn't seen since their separation. She said Laura had begun psychological treatment, that she was reclusive, and that she hadn't told anyone, but that she was going through a deep process of regret. Daniel read it and put his phone in his pocket. He didn't respond. Not out of indifference, but because he knew this journey was now hers. He had already made his own. He had written letters, planned surprises, dreamed of children, exhausted himself trying to save something that was falling apart. Now it was her turn to bear the weight of what she had taken for granted. Days later, he ran into her again by chance. This time, in a market. It was brief. She saw him from afar and looked away. He pretended not to notice. But he noticed. He noticed her expression. Her lowered eyes, her more hunched body, her slower gestures. She had changed. Perhaps she was beginning to understand. And although he was already in another story, he was still too human not to feel something. It was like watching someone weather a storm you yourself had once faced. He knew nothing he said now would make a difference. Because some pains must be endured in silence. Some truths can only be learned in the void. That night, Laura walked to her apartment balcony. She looked out at the city lights and, for the first time in a long time, took a deep breath without sobbing. The pain was still there, but it was beginning to transform into learning. She knew there was no going back. She didn't expect reconciliation, nor a second chance. What she wanted now was to forgive herself. And that, she was beginning to understand, was the longest process of all. Meanwhile, Daniel put the boy to bed. He told stories, adjusted the blanket, and gave him a final goodnight kiss. He felt at peace. He felt whole. And, in that nighttime silence, he thought briefly of Laura. But without hurt. Without rancor. Just as a distant memory of someone who was part of his story, but now in the past. And that was it. Some people mark us forever. Others teach us, painfully, to value true love. But few teach us both at the same time. And Laura was one of them. Now, all that was left was to figure out what to do with it. Because for her, love wasn't dead, it was gone. And it took with it the woman she dreamed of being. Time moved forward with merciless slowness for Laura. Not as a punishment imposed by the world, but as an inevitable consequence of everything she had let slip through her fingers. Ever since her last silent encounter with Daniel, at the market, where they had merely glanced at each other for a split second and not a single gesture was made, something inside her began to take shape. It was no longer regret, that already inhabited her routine like a part of her very body, it was something deeper, more human, more difficult to deal with, the acceptance that there was no going back, and that some choices truly amputate pieces of us that can never be regenerated. The pain was no longer sharp, as before, but persistent, like a burn that had already healed but left the skin numb. She no longer cried every day. But she also didn't smile. She lived suspended, between a version of the past that no longer existed and a future she didn't know how to build. In therapy, he began to explore not only what he did, but why he did it. He began to revisit parts of himself he'd never looked at deeply, the fear of being invisible, the insatiable desire for validation, the way his self-love had always been conditioned by someone else's approval. During the sessions, Daniel appeared in almost every good memory. But, contrary to what she expected, this didn't keep her trapped in the past. On the contrary, it allowed her to see that love only existed because it was planted with truth on both sides, and destroyed, yes, but not without first existing with real force. Understanding this hurt, but it was necessary. She needed to recognize the value of what she lost so she could truly begin to understand who she was now. And more importantly, who she wanted to be from the pain. One day, she decided to visit the bookstore where their reunion had taken place. The place still smelled of new paper and varnished wood, but it seemed smaller than she remembered. She walked the aisles slowly, touching the spines with her fingers, as if searching for something invisible among the shelves. At the back of the store, she found a book that used to be Daniel's favorite, a collection of letters written by ordinary people, telling of loves that didn't work out. She picked it up, leafed through it, and felt her eyes well up when she found a letter that began, "I lost you on the day you chose me most." She closed the book carefully, took it to the register, paid, and left. She didn't need to reread that letter. She already knew it by heart, having written it, unknowingly, with each wrong choice. Without planning, she walked to a small cafe, one of those hidden in the middle of a nearly silent street, where no one knew her. She ordered a tea and sat by the window, watching people pass by with a rush she no longer felt. After a few minutes of contemplation, she decided to pick up her cell phone, which for days had been off more than it was on, and wrote a message to the friend she'd spoken to in the square. She asked to meet her again. She needed to talk, needed to say things that were still stuck in her throat, like thorns in her throat. They arranged to meet the next day, in a park they'd frequented years before, where footsteps echoed on dry leaves and conversations seemed to last longer than time allowed. On the appointed morning, Laura arrived early. She sat on a secluded bench and waited, her gaze lost on some point on the horizon. Her friend arrived smiling, but the smile quickly faded when she noticed the seriousness in Laura's expression. After a tight hug, they remained silent for a few minutes, until she took a deep breath and said, almost in a whisper, "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself." Her friend took her hand and replied, "You don't need to forgive yourself to move on. You just need to decide not to repeat the pain." It struck her like a calming bolt of lightning. The words weren't spoken harshly, but with an uncomfortable clarity. And she understood. Spending her life trying to make amends with the past would be a subtle way of remaining trapped in it. And that was no longer where she was meant to live. The following week, Laura returned to an old, abandoned project, a photography course she'd put aside when everything seemed to revolve solely around other people's agendas. The first few classes were timid, almost mechanical. But little by little, she began to see the world through a different lens, literally and emotionally. She discovered that when framing a scene, she chose what to exclude, what to value, what to keep in focus. And this, somehow, resonated with what she needed to do with herself. She learned to select what still made sense to keep in view and what was just noise. Meanwhile, Daniel was immersing himself in his fatherly role. The boy was already calling him "Daddy" naturally, and he responded with the same ease. He spent weekends in parks, cooked pancakes on Sundays, and laughed loudly with his partner during dinner. It wasn't an idealized happiness. It was real, with its weariness, differences, and difficult days. But it was true. And that was enough. The past no longer haunted him. He had learned that some chapters in life don't need to be rewritten, just closed with dignity. And that's what he had done. One late afternoon, weeks later, Laura received an unexpected call. It was Daniel's mother. She hesitated before answering, but the urge overcame her. On the other end of the line, the elderly voice sounded more fragile than she remembered. The woman said she'd heard from acquaintances that Laura was going through a profound change and that she didn't want to judge her, that she never would, but that she needed to tell her something. She wanted her to know that, despite everything, her family never hated her. They were silent, yes, and they distanced themselves, but not out of contempt. It was out of respect for Daniel's suffering. His mother's voice then trembled slightly before adding, "You were part of our story. And, in some way, you still are. Because the love you shared with my son existed. And it doesn't need to be erased for him to move on." That sentence was like a breath of humanity in a world that seemed to only return stones. After hanging up, Laura cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. But this time it was different. It was a clean cry, a cry of liberation. For the first time, she felt that maybe she didn't need to punish herself anymore. That maybe the pain had already served its purpose. That maybe there was room to start over, not with Daniel, not with another love, but with herself. And it was with this seed in hand that, days later, when photographing a child running free among autumn leaves, she smiled. She truly smiled, with her eyes. She captured that moment with the lens, and with her heart. It was just a child running. But for her, it was the purest symbol of what she hoped to experience again, freedom to be, to make mistakes, to learn, and, who knows, perhaps one day, to love again, without haste, without guilt, without fear. On that rainy morning, Laura woke before the sun even rose. The sky was still a gray patch over the buildings, and the sound of the fine drops on the window seemed to coincide with the rhythm of her breathing. She felt lighter, not from the absence of pain, but from having finally accepted that some wounds become part of who we are, and that time doesn't erase them, but teaches us to live with them. She had made peace with the past, not as someone who forgets, but as someone who embraces reality with the maturity of someone who understands that some losses are forever. For the first time in a long time, she no longer expected forgiveness from anyone but herself. She was learning to walk alone, without nostalgia and without the illusory hope of reconquest. Longing still accompanied her, yes, but it had lost its former weight. Now it was a gentle reminder of what she had experienced, not a poison corroding the nights. He decided to leave home and visit an art gallery where there was a small exhibition of independent photographers. He had sent some of his images, more on impulse than pretension, and to his surprise, one of them had been selected. It was a photo of a woman from behind, walking alone down a dirt road among dry trees. Simple. Raw. But full of meaning that only she could translate. Upon arriving, he stood in silence before his own image hanging on one of the walls. A woman stopped beside her and commented that the photograph carried something powerful, as if it were a portrait of a farewell that both hurt and liberated. Laura just smiled, her eyes welling up. That was exactly it. And in that moment, she understood that perhaps art was the only place where pain truly found beauty. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his routine, completely immersed in the life he had chosen to build. Little by little, the boy he called his son no longer did so with the same insecurity as before. He was "Daddy" under any circumstances, and that was enough to make him feel complete. His new partner was a firm but never invasive presence. Together, they built a relationship that didn't require daily proof, just consistent gestures. He continued writing, although now his texts were no longer letters that would never be delivered, but personal reflections, fragments of life, pieces of the peace he found in small situations, a game in the backyard, a family dinner, an ordinary evening that ended with a sincere hug. Daniel didn't need to forget Laura to be happy, and that was one of the greatest lessons of his life. Pain, when accepted, loses its power of control. He had stopped waiting for apologies, because he no longer carried resentment. The past was part of him, but it didn't define him. One day, while walking with the boy through a street fair, he saw a group of young people handing out flyers for a social project related to photography. Curious, he stopped to understand. The project involved children from vulnerable neighborhoods and used photography as a tool for emotional expression. Without much thought, he took the contact information and took it home. That same week, he called and volunteered. He wasn't a photographer, but he understood reconstruction. And he thought he could contribute. That's how, one afternoon, arriving for one of the workshops, he heard her name mentioned by one of the organizers. Laura was also a volunteer there, on another shift. He wasn't surprised. Somehow, it seemed inevitable that their paths would cross again, not as before, but as adults who now knew exactly what they wanted, and what they had lost. And then, months after that silence in the market, they saw each other again. It was at a project event, a showcase of the best photos taken by the children. She was on one side, he on the other. The exchanged glance held no weight, no drama. Just recognition. Daniel, holding his son, waved from afar. Laura returned it with a restrained gesture. After the event, they ended up meeting in the narrow hallway of the warehouse where the exhibition had been set up. He smiled. She smiled back. There was no hug, no promises, just an exchange of light words, as if that moment were just the last fold in a book they had both decided to close, each in their own way. Laura, with a calm look in her eyes, said she was happy to see him well. Daniel thanked her, saying he always knew she would find her way. She then looked at the boy and asked if he liked taking pictures. Daniel replied yes, that the little boy already wanted a camera of his own. She bent down, looked at the child tenderly, and said she hoped to see a photo of him at the next exhibition. He smiled, and in that smile, there was more purity and hope than either of them could explain. Daniel then said, we learn from what we destroy, too. Laura nodded slightly. Nothing more needed to be said. That night, each returned home with their hearts at peace. There was no reconciliation. There was no love reborn. But there was a dignity that only true pain teaches, the ability to accept the end without resentment. The ability to know that, despite everything, that love existed and was real, even if it died due to one party's lack of care. Laura no longer sought redemption outside herself. She had understood, over time, that not all mistakes are fixable, but they can all be transformed into tools for growth. Daniel, for his part, had let go of any trauma. He was happy, complete, whole, and knew that everything he had been through had helped him become who he was now, a man who loves deeply, but who also knows when leaving is the greatest proof of love he can give himself. Time passed. And fate, with its subtle irony, decided to cross their paths one last time, years later, now older, far from everything that had once united them. It was in a bookstore, just like in the beginning. Daniel was looking for a gift for his son, now a teenager. Laura was one of the photographers honored in an art exhibition inspired by transformation. They greeted each other, exchanged a few words, and at the end, she handed him one of her photographs with a discreet dedication on the back: "Pain broke me, but truth rebuilt me. Thank you for being part of my story, even when I wanted to run away from it." He read it, smiled serenely, and carefully put the image away. Then he left, without looking back, taking with him the certainty that he had lived a painful story, yes, but with a dignified, human, and real ending. Now that you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear from you. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do so now. Every week we have powerful, real, and profound stories like this one, ones that make us reflect, feel, and learn from what we often prefer to ignore. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it nullifies trust, erases plans, corrupts dreams, and, above all, shatters a part of the betrayed person, a part that may never be the same again. Cheating is giving up on what you've built. It's not knowing how to appreciate what was achieved with time, patience, and love. And in the end, the bill comes due. Because regret comes late. And forgiveness isn't always accompanied by a return. This channel does not support any type of betrayal here, we show its consequences with respect, realism, and responsibility. May this story serve as a warning, a mirror, and a memory of what is lost when desire speaks louder than loyalty. Until the next story.